بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وآله وأصحابه وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين. اللهم ربنا أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه، اللهم أرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه، اللهم أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي. ربنا زدنا علما وعملا وإخلاصا يا رب العالمين. اللهم انصر أولياءك في غزة وفي فلسطين كلها وفي اليمن وفي لبنان وفي العراق وفي كل مكان. اللهم ثبت اللهم انصرهم على عدوك وعدوهم إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم انصرهم على عدوك وعدوهم إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم فرج عنا وعن إخواننا في غزة وفي فلسطين كلها وفي اليمن وفي لبنان وفي العراق في كل مكان. اللهم نفس كربنا وكربنا وثبت أقدامنا وأقدامهم والتف بنا وبهم يا رب العالمين. اللهم آمين. وصل وسلم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وآله وصحبه وأزواجه وذريته أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم. So we're going to look at this short article, Certainty and Change in Capitalist Order. Okay, so capitalism was born in roughly in the 11th century in some city-states in Italy. So it's not necessarily a Protestant thing. Throughout its history, it has undergone structural changes. While remaining the same as far as the spirit is concerned. We know spirit of capitalism from Max Weber. So structure, so what's the spirit and structure? So for us, the spirit of capitalism just means core purpose or objective. Which is accumulation for the sake of accumulation. That's the spirit. So you accumulate so you can accumulate more. And the structure simply mean the way this is actually done in a particular society at a particular time in a particular space. Okay. And when we talk about city-states, Italian city-state states, you're talking about Venice and Florence and those states. And what emerged there was basically a financial capitalism in the form of banks and all that. So, where in those city-states, you can trace back many of the so-called financial innovations, which were later necessary for the development of mature capitalism, which sort of re-emerged or relocated itself in 16th century, 15th, 16th century Europe, England and Netherlands, and later in Northern America. And so many of those were developed in city-state Italian city-state like Venice, Florence, and one of the reason people don't remember those states now and their contribution to the development of uh, capitalism, because those city-states didn't survive politically. In contrast to that, England and Netherlands and the United States still pretty much exist. uh, so they, so in a sense, England and Netherlands and 15th and 16th century Europeans were basically continuing something which had existed in the city-states of Italy in 12th century and beyond that. Okay, so capitalism was born in the 11th century in some city-states of Italy. Towards its history, it has undergone structural changes while remaining the same. As far as its spirit is concerned. The interplay of certainty and change is intensified in modern era. So certainty is the certainty of spirit, continuity of spirit, and change is the structural change. How that spirit is to be embodied in particular systems, particular economic and political orders. So today's global capitalist economy is dominated by relative production stagnation, financialization. So these are structural characteristics of the modern political global economy, advanced capitalism. So if one is relative production stagnation, it's always relative because without production there can't be any financialization. But financialization becomes the core of modern and postmodern capitalism today, which is different from 19th century, for example, where production was involved. 19th and early 20th century, even the second half of 20th century up to 1970. And rapid increase in interpersonal and income wealth distributional inequalities. So these are three characteristics of the structural characteristics of the modern capitalism, which differentiate it from, for example, post-war capitalism. Relatively speaking, obviously, because those things are always present in capitalism. So let us look at these three things. So what is relative production stagnation and why it happens, and what is financialization, and what distributional inequalities, and why are they needed, and why are they necessary to capitalism, especially postmodern capitalism. So the first thing is relative production stagnation. And that happens for various reasons, but one of the reasons is, in a sense, production from the outset puts a limit on capital accumulation, because production is time consuming, it has to go through the whole cycle. So you have to produce something, then you have to procure labor and all the problems associated with wages and um, the interpersonal relationship among labor intra and between labor and the capital and all that. But then production, so it takes time, requires capital, requires money, requires organization. So after production, you have distribution, which requires time. Then there's a consumption, and then you get, profit. Part of you reinvest, so the cycle restarts. So this is a long cycle. So even before any other crisis or any other external problems, there is always a limit with production puts on the spirit of capitalism, which is more and more without uh, much delay. you know I, I want it now, and I want it all. That the spirit, in a sense. And there are other historical limits. For example, saturation. Whenever you have the development of capitalist production at the start, there's a lot more capacity for profits. But as the production capitalism develop, it saturates the opportunities for investments decrease because the rate of return decreased for various reasons. That's why capitalism, that's why that's why imperialism is inherent to capitalism, because capitalism sort of migrates to the areas where investments are still not saturated, and the rate of return and expectations of profits and are still high, etc. So within the advanced world, once it is developed, the rate of returns for various historical reasons and production, because of the rise in the living standards and the wages, etc., the rate of profits declines. So production migrates to, overseas, to China and other countries, and that's called the relative stagnation of production. And the main accumulation start, the capital investment and accumulation start occurring in other areas, in services, in banking and financial system, because in financial, so that's where financialization comes in, because in financialization, the step between production and, although it still depends on production, but not as closely as if you are doing production itself. So production, the cycle of production and financialization, you invest in, you give out loans, and you invest in bonds, or you invest in money market and capital market. The returns are the money the investment doesn't have to go through all the cycle and wait through the cycle of production, consumption, and then reinvest investments, and the circuit is sort of minimized, and the return are more than the returns in production and quicker, and uh, those limits of time and space, etc., are to a certain extent, to a greater extent, overcome. So financial the banks become more important, the stock market becomes more important, money market becomes more important, the capital market becomes more important, and the bulk of accumulation occurs in those markets rather than production market and production. So that's what financial and income inequalities. Obviously, income inequalities are always there. Especially at the start, wages, as Marx wrote, as other Engels wrote. Labor, the 19th century, early 19th century wages were very low just to sustain the labor and its reproduction. But as the capitalists developed and moved to colonialism and imperialism, wages were increased in order to strengthen political um, order of capitalism. So although even the inequalities exist still, they are reduced between capitalist class and the labor class. But once the capitalist develop and concentrates in the advanced capitalist countries, the rate of returns become relatively rates of profit become less. The the relative difference between the capital and the labor increases again. Then income distribution and inequality becomes the means of increasing those profits, etc. So, so these are the three trends, structural trends of um, capitalism, postmodern capitalism, which are different from other eras of capitalism. But the spirit remains the same, which is accumulation for the sake of accumulation. And these three trends represent the strength of capitalism as well as its um, weaknesses. So today's global capitalist economy is dominated by relative production stagnation, financialization, and rapid increase in interpersonal and income and wealth distributional inequalities. Rapid digitalization has led to the macro systematic dominance of a small handful of tech giants conglomerates who appropriate surplus through fictitiously enhanced rents and monopolies rather than through innovation. We are in the era of intellectual monopoly capitalism. Okay, so this is a bit heavy, so we'll start with it next time. We'll focus on this. What is rapid digitalization and monopolization and appropriation of surplus and rents and monopolies and innovation and all that. Okay. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد ان لا اله الا انت نستغفرك ونتوب صلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وأزواجه برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين اللهم آمين